My father returned to Scarborough, England early on B release to fix buildings because he was a roof tiler. But I never asked him about that. I had a feeling that being a fit young man in 1945, in a world overjoyed that the war had ended, and one of the first back, would have its advantages. He didn't want to talk about that. The only photos I found was him with what was eventually his brother's wife, so I don't know how that worked out. The only time my father got emotional when describing the war in Burma was when he saw a colleague slowly die of asthma. In 2004, I told him that when he returned home from the war, he was running up a hill with a girl he was very keen on with a picnic basket. She coughed and spluttered. He realised that she had asthma and he dropped her like a stone. When my son Matthew was about 2, we learnt that he had asthma. I was quite unhappy. I was young enough that life still seemed perfect, and this shattered my illusion. My father, however, went absolutely ballistic. You would have thought he had only minutes to live. It was only years later when hearing these stories that his reaction made sense. And here's one of the big things about these videos. All of the violence and killing has been stripped out of it. Clearly, when my father told this story, he didn't want to relive that. The part about the asthma was when he was caught in a bomb crater with a bunch of guys, and the Japanese were going past. The guy had asthma and was making a noise, and he would have given them away. When the Japanese had passed and they left the bomb crater, the guy with asthma never left the bomb crater. I can't imagine what that sort of stuff does to you. So I asked Mum how they met. She said that when Dad left the Air Force, he was looking for something to replace the friendship he knew in the service. He joined the 1x1 club, cadet club, training kids from 15 years old. They had a canteen, and Mum was in the Women's Junior Air Club, and they wanted someone to service the canteen on training nights. Dad was the under manager, and that's how they met. Dad was 27 and Mum was 16. They married a year and a half later on Christmas Eve 1949. Then they had my older sister and then my older brother. They immigrated to Australia in 1956 on the Strathern Ava. I was interested in some of his paperwork and what the Australian government wanted, and I found this very nice commenting that they were an average to good family, which is quite cute. So he moved to Australia and he raised all his kids, and we grew up. Then in, what was the date, 2011, I moved to Perth to work for a big mining company. It was difficult for someone who had lived in the same place their whole life to move. Above all, there was one thing that always sat in the back of my mind, the fact that I left my elderly parents behind. The thought that one day the time would come when things went wrong. And of course they did. My sister rang to say that my dad had had 2 heart attacks and pneumonia, a combination that for a 93-year-old at that stage suggested that the end was near. She said it probably wasn't going to happen that day, but sometime soon. It was my son's birthday, so I said nothing to the family. The next day I arranged at work to go and told the family that night. Travel last minute on the Friday during school holidays was a bit problematic. My father was in Wollongong Hospital and had the familiar sunken eye sockets of someone very sick. He was clear enough to talk to my children via me writing words, because he was deaf, and using a hands-free phone, they could hear his responses. My daughter recorded a video of them listening to my father singing the familiar nursery rhymes, and the smile and tears on my daughter's face shows the connection yet understanding they had with what was going on. That video that we'll see in a sec is the reason why I created these videos. Years ago, after a knee operation, I needed intensive physio for 6 months. The physio said he was moved almost to tears by watching my daughter, then 13, so concerned and looking at me and stroking my head. I never actually understood why he was so taken until I saw my mum feeding my dad. Just to say my dad's a proud man is an understatement. To see my mother feeding my father so carefully made me realise what it meant. By contrast, when my mother was distracted, I thought I should probably continue feeding him. I picked up my spoon and my father looked at me with deathly eyes, and he reefed it out of my hand and fed himself. That wasn't going to happen. So he spent, yeah. So I'll show you the video of my daughter. Mary had a little lamb and then... So there was one about the lamb ended up dead, and then it ended up between two slices of bread. That was something like. And then there was one about. Did Granite have a trampoline at any stage?
Not that I can remember. We did though, so maybe when he came into our house.
Perhaps, yeah. Perhaps, yeah. Yeah, okay. What's the time? It's 3:10 in Perth. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. It followed her to school one day, which was against the rule. It made it in the laugh and play to see a lamb at school. Did you hear that scene?
Yes, I did.
What?
Yeah, I did.
And Mary had another lamb. The butcher killed it dead. And now she takes that lamb to school between two crusts of bread. Did you hear the second verse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad he still remembers that. Tell him that I love him. So we spent Wednesday with him. He was moved to a new ward, the ward. I said a big goodbye, knowing it was unlikely I'd ever see him again. The last thing he said to me was, "This dying business is shit." Probably the only time in his life I ever heard him complain. Despite the pain relief, he was not very happy. My sister went back down the coast and my brother and I stayed at Mum's. I was to fly out the next day. The next morning at 3:30 a.m. the phone rang. I was told Dad had another heart attack and passed away. I held Mum and told her as gently as I could, not that it made any difference. My sister rang and took Mum to hospital. It was a solemn drive in, but in hindsight, so beneficial to have said goodbye to him in that way. Apparently, Dad said he wanted his name to return to Donahoe. Our understanding was that was a surname at first, but we sorted it out to be his middle name. Then we had the funeral. And then I went home. The events of October 2014, when he died, to see Dad and attend the funeral was a mixture of sharp memories and blurry bits. A positive event to spend it with my siblings, but obviously sad in Dad passing. But now, 2 months later, was my 50th birthday, and I'd chosen and arranged much earlier to have it over Easter again. So that was a planned event. So I took my family to see the grave that I hadn't seen, and down the bottom was his name. It struck me that all that history was summarised in the text string: Frank Donahoe Lil, 21/6/21, 9/10/14, and that this text string was one of thousands in this cemetery alone. Then I forgot that filling insignificant stuff and concentrated on my children, the youngest two, seeing them above, remembering my father only as a very old guy who told them silly stories and sang them very silly songs.